Chronicles is made possible by a grant from the Erie Community Foundation, a community assets grant provided by the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, support from Spring Hill Senior Living, the Regional Science Consortium, and the generous support of Thomas B. Hagen.
This is WQLN.
The year is 1857. James Buchanan from Pennsylvania is sworn in as the United States' 15th president. At the same time, westward expansion continues as American settlers continue to push Native Americans out of their territories and, in many cases, forcibly relocate them. The expansion leads to railroads being built for easier transportation. The women's rights movement, particularly focused on women's right to vote, is also beginning to gain steam. That same year, the Supreme Court ruled on the Dred Scott v. Stanford case. This decision declared that African Americans could not claim United States citizenship, therefore had no standing in federal court, while also setting precedent that Congress could not prohibit slavery on federally controlled land, as in the largely unsettled West. The country is barreling toward a civil war. By August, the U.S. economy is falling apart. The Ohio Insurance and Trust Company is forced to cut off payments following a string of bad financial decisions. This, in turn, triggered what's known now as the nationwide panic of 1857. Amidst all the chaos of that time, a figure who would make it her life's work to disrupt the status quo is born. Ida Minerva Tarbell was born in a log cabin in Hatch Hallow, Pennsylvania, November 5th, 1857, to Franklin and Esther Tarbell. The cabin was nestled in a wooded area near Wattsburg in Erie County. Esther's parents owned the property, which also contained a small farm. Overall, it was a beautiful place where nature was the main feature.
Ida's parents, Esther and Franklin, when they were a young couple, they planned to move west, which is what seemed to be the general mood of young people, and that's how our country was settled.
Franklin left Erie County and went to Iowa, and the plan was he was going to work and he was going to build a house and get things ready for Esther to join him. And at this point, Esther was pregnant with Ida, but the panic of 1857 threw things in disarray, so financial markets bottomed out, and the money that Franklin had saved now wasn't worth as much as it had been. So moving Esther out, especially pregnant, was not a viable option. And the dreams of moving to Iowa, at least at that point, were put on hold, but Franklin needed to get back to Esther.
When Franklin returns in 1859, Ida is about a year and a half old. The couple is weighing their options for their family's future. One idea was to head back to Iowa to give the family farm idea another shot.
In the end of 1859, Edwin Drake was incredibly lucky. If he had drilled 50 feet in either direction, he might not have hit what we call the Drake Stray sand. It was a very shallow layer of sandstone, very narrow in width, that produced the oil which he tapped into. And people came from all over the country, forming their own oil companies or just drilling on their own.
And so there's all this hubbub going on about this oil strike, and people are flocking to the area. And as Franklin keeps hearing more about it, he decides to come down to Titusville and check it out for himself. And the closer he got to Titusville, the more he kept hearing, and the more he kept thinking maybe he should be one of the thousands coming to the area and seeing about this new industry and what he could do. Franklin opens up business making barrels and is pretty good at it. And so ultimately, Esther and Ida join him there in Pithole.
Pithole was a Wild West town with, drinking and dancing girls, and also some people who were trying to have stable lives and home lives as the Tarbells were. There was also horrible fires and accidents, and Ida, growing up, saw some really devastating victims of terrible fires. So that was Wild Pithole, and it was very different from Hatch Hallow.
My first reaction to my new surroundings was one of acute dislike. It aroused me to a revolt, which is the first thing I'm sure I remember about my life. The birth in me of conscious experience. This revolt did not come from natural depravity. On the contrary, it was a natural and righteous protest against having the life and home I had known, and which I loved, taken away without explanation, and a new scene, a new set of rules, which I did not like, suddenly imposed.
Despite Ida's opposition to her new surroundings, the Tarbell family would spend the next several years living in and around Pithole. Ida recalls a particular day when all the adults in Pithole had really low spirits. The event occurred on April 12, 1861, the day of the Battle of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the start of the American Civil War. One trait that stood out in Ida's early years is that of an acute inquisitiveness about the world around her.
At a very young age, Ida realized that she really liked science and really wanted to try things. And the family shanty was along Cherry Run Creek, and she kept noticing things going by in the creek and how some things floated and some things, if you tossed into the creek, immediately sank to the bottom. So she was curious what her brother would do. And her brother at this point is a baby. So luckily he had enough dressing gowns on. So when she put him in the creek, he floated, probably because of all the material kept him buoyant. And Esther immediately plucked him out of the creek. But yeah, that was Ida's early experiment. She learned that her brother floated in the creek.
What was also happening then was that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the origin of the species, was becoming known. And Franklin Tarbell was a very religious man, and he was a by-the-book Bible man. And this general upheaval made Ida wonder who was right. And so she decided she would find out for herself, and she had a microscope, and she thought she was going to find the origin of life. And I just love it that she did that.
It was also at this time that a young man named John D. Rockefeller was starting his career in Cleveland, Ohio. He was working with a company that transported grain using the still expanding railroad system. This business became crucial in the effort to feed Union troops on the front lines. Due to this success, John was able to pay so-called replacement soldiers to take his place on the battlefield so he could continue his work making sure they were fed. As the boomtown of Pithole begins its decline, some businessmen, like Franklin Tarbell, must adapt to survive. The Standard Oil Company, owned and operated at the time by John D. Rockefeller, is gaining control over the oil industry as a whole.
A skilled cooper, it still takes a day to make one barrel. And when you've got 1,000 barrel, 3,000 a day wells, you need a lot of coopers. So then machines are invented and developed to make barrels faster.
Franklin recognizes that his wooden oil barrels only have a certain shelf life because they're not the most practical thing to ship oil. They leak, of course. So fortunately for him, he recognizes that this is not a long-standing venture and actually then goes into producing oil with a few partners. And that's how he's able to continue in the industry, but in a different fashion.
When Esther and Franklin moved to Titusville when Ida was probably about 12, she didn't like being the new girl and the stranger, and at that point of time, she just wasn't totally ready for a transition. I think that boom and bust Wild West that was Pithole, it did make her wary of excessive risk.
There was born in me a hatred of privilege of any sort. It was all pretty hazy, to be sure, but it still was well at 15 to have one definite plan based on things seen and heard, ready for a future platform of social and economic justice if I should ever awake to my need of one.
She expressed her unhappiness by cutting class and doing whatever she wanted and pretty much defying everybody. And she did that until a teacher said, "It is such a shame that such an intelligent girl is just running wild." And that was what Ida needed to hear, and she changed, and she became quite a good student, an excellent student, and she made her own structure. That was the young Ida, probably up till the time she went to college.
Allegheny College, located in Meadville, Pennsylvania, was originally founded in 1815 by Reverend Timothy Alden. It's one of just a few dozen institutions in the country that survived the Civil War era. Today, it's considered one of the oldest colleges in the country.
She had been looking at Cornell University, who had just started admitting women, I believe, in 1872. But Allegheny, it's closer, and started admitting women sooner. So she was the only woman in her class, and I think there were only 4 or 5 other women overall in the school at that time. And there were things that she just didn't think of. She finds this cozy spot under a tree to read and sits down. And she's corrected by one of the other female students that, no, you can't sit there. That's for men only. And we think of that now as like, that's just so ridiculous. But that's just how it was.
Ida was part of the first generation and the first years of women going to college. And not all women went. It was still the exception to the rule. I mean, her mother's experience had been, if you get married, you can't have a career. You really pretty much had to choose one or the other. You get married, you stop working in the world. And Ida, she planned to go on. She planned to be a scientist. However, by the time she graduated, the Tarbell fortunes had changed, partly because of John D. Rockefeller. And there were really 2 career paths that were open to her: teaching. Another opportunity was missionary work. And Ida said that she had learned in her study of comparative religions that the heathens were as righteous as the Bible people, so she was not interested in that.
Being still in that early stage of development where there must be a definite word by which to classify oneself, I began to call myself a pantheist. And I had a creed, which I had repeated. Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. It reassured me I was on the right track, for was I not going to find out with the microscope what God and man are?
Ida was very interested in the world, and she wanted to be part of it.
While curious about many aspects of the natural world, one topic Ida does not appear to explore, especially in her younger years, was that of interpersonal relationships, particularly those of a romantic nature.
She never marries. She's definitely career focused. Again, very unusual for the time period. Even more so as the oldest child, there would have been some sort of expectation, and there was no pressure from her parents to, no, you don't go to school, or yes, you can go to school, but as soon as you're done, you're getting married. There wasn't a push for that.
Well, society said that most women are to marry, right? Women's job is to get married and have children, to reproduce. It was not very common for women to graduate, particularly from college in the 1870s and 1880s, but it is becoming more so because there are people advocating for women getting the right to vote. The suffrage campaign begins in 1848 in Seneca Falls, and women are going to college to better themselves, and in some cases to better themselves for their future husbands. So it is rare for women to go to college in the 19th century, rare for that to happen, and it is even more uncommon for them to not get married. Even if they're going to an all-female college, some of them are going to end up getting married. So why didn't Tarbell get married? Who knows?
Ida graduates from Allegheny College, and she accepts a position at Poland Union Seminary, and that's Poland, Ohio, not too far away from the Meadville, Titusville area. She takes on this position as a teacher with the assumption that she will teach by day and continue her own studies on her own time, and that does not come true.
In terms of professional women during this period, really, they're teachers. And there aren't great numbers of them, but there are women establishing schools around the country. For example, Mount Holyoke, right, which is still in existence, was established during this period as a female seminary, but it grows to become a college. Georgia, around 1809, I believe it was established. It became a Wesleyan college where women began to matriculate. And so teachers, in 1845, for example, Catherine Beecher, who established one of those female seminaries, wrote a book entitled What American Women Should Do. And what she argued in that book was that they should go west and teach because people were moving westward because of westward expansion, the exploration of the area towards the Pacific. And so there was this need, people believed that we needed to provide, for lack of a better word, civilization. And with civilization comes education, or with education comes civilization. So women began to teach. But there were limits to women's employment outside the home.
It was not a happy professional experience for her. She took the place of a beloved teacher that everyone loved her and let Ida know this. And she discovered that this beloved teacher had given the same tests year after year. So everybody came to school knowing what the tests were going to be, and they, of course, did quite nicely. Well, Ida was not going to go along with that. So she found another book, and other tests, and gave those tests, and people did not do well.
She talks about some of the subjects that she's supposed to teach, she doesn't really know much about. So she's actually learning as she's teaching, and she feels that she pulls it off pretty well. So all that off time that she expected to have to do her own thing, she's really learning to do her own job. And so at the end of 2 years, she mentions that it was sort of an unwritten agreement between her and the president that she would resign, and resign she does. So she comes back from Poland, Ohio, and she moves back home to this house. She's not quite sure what she's going to do next, but at least she has a safe place to land and to figure it out.
There was a magazine that was being developed. It was the Chautauquan. And that was an outgrowth of what became the Chautauqua Institution, which had started out as a summer Bible camp for Methodists. And it was a Bible study program, but they expanded it into other kinds of learning because people were so hungry for knowledge.
So the family's very in tune with Chautauqua, and she's home from Poland and doesn't really have a clear path forward. And so Reverend Theodore Flood, who was the publisher of the Chautauquan magazine, and knowing her educational background, he offers her a temporary position at the Chautauquan magazine, partially to annotate some of the articles, because the magazine would often get mailed questions about how do you pronounce this foreign word, or could you tell me more about this particular thing. The readership was wide, and so in some areas they didn't have libraries or other resources to where the readers could go and answer their own questions, so they turned back to the magazine for those answers. And so that's why Reverend Flood offers her that position to do that, because she is very well educated and could be very well set up to answer those questions quickly.
She was involved in every phase of it. And soon, I think the circulation boomed to like 65,000 by the time she left. One of the things she did, they had her do everything. She was also answering mail, and people were seeking advice. And Ida would do a little freelance Miss Lonely Hearts and give people advice on what they should do and how they should proceed.
And everything's going fine until this person comes to visit Meadville and wants to meet with Reverend Flood and thank him for all of his sage advice. He, of course, meets with Flood, and Flood has no idea of what this person's referring to, and then tells him, well, Miss Tarbell writes all of my correspondence. The person is crestfallen to learn that a woman, of all people, has been writing to him, and he's been taking this advice, and he leaves the office kind of in a sullen manner and never writes to the Chautauquan magazine again.
Ida ultimately worked for the Chautauquan for nearly 8 years until 1891. But eventually, her thirst for knowledge led to her feeling restless. Another one of her many interests included the French Revolution and one of the most notable women of the time, Madame Roland. Ida planned to write a book about her influence on France during that time of social upheaval. With all of this in mind, she begins to feel a pull in the direction of France. Once there, she planned to explore, or rather, research the people and their culture.
This coincided with the period where Ida was really bored with what she'd been doing, or more to the point, she'd found what she really wanted to do, which was more writing.
She does have this interest in the French Revolution, especially the women associated with it. But where do you go to learn more about the women of the French Revolution? You're not going to learn much in Titusville, Meadville, Pennsylvania, the United States. In typical Ida fashion, she wants to learn more, and she knows that she's the only one that's going to be able to fully answer her questions.
Where was I to carry on this research? There was but one place: Paris. I did not consider the possibility of getting a regular job. I did not want one. I wanted freedom. And I had an idea that there was no freedom in belonging to things, no freedom in security. It took time to convince myself that I dared go on my own. But finally, I succeeded.
Paris, beautiful, beautiful Paris, was absolutely thrilling and enchanting. I'm sure it seemed like Oz. At that time, science and art, everything was booming. You had Louis Pasteur. They were curing diphtheria. The novels, Ida wrote her sister. The oranges and the greens and the yellows howl, she wrote. That was her description of the Impressionists. She went one night to the Moulin Rouge. Even as she had to go about getting rooms, she and her friends, and finding out how they were going to eat and, how she was going to get paid. She was living a real life in this fabulous setting.
She's writing articles that then she's getting published in the U.S., and that's how she's making money, although she's not making a lot of money. Her main interest is Madame Roland, who kind of has some parallels to Ida in a way. But that being a woman, her her interests and her writings weren't going to be taken as seriously or be as widely distributed as if she were a man.
So one of the obstacles that women faced in the 19th century was their legal right to do things like sign contracts. They couldn't even have a bank account without their husband's name on it or their father's name on it, or maybe an older brother. Some of these things will begin to change in the mid-19th century as there are more and more women living by themselves. And these are not great numbers. We're not talking about this massive onslaught of single women, but there are some places where there are laws that give single women the right to inherit, the right to hold property, but it varies.
Coming to a decision has a loosening, tonic effect on a mind which has been floundering in uncertainty. Liberated, it rushes gaily, hopefully, to the charting of a new course. I had no sooner resolved to strike out on my own than my mind was bubbling with plans. I forgot that I was 33 years old, and according to the code of my time and my society, too old for new ventures. I forgot that outside of my very limited experience on the Chautauquan, I knew nothing of the writing and publishing world, had literally no acquaintance among editors. I forgot that I was afraid of people, believed them all so much greater and more important than they often turned out to be, that it cost me nervous chills to venture with a request into a stranger's presence.
Scribner's magazine began publication in 1887. It printed a wide range of articles on countless topics. Ida, being someone who explored her varying interests daily, was a great fit for such a magazine. Ida sent a piece into Scribner's magazine. She didn't expect anything to come of it, but much to her surprise, the editor offered her a position. Samuel Sidney McClure, better known as S.S. McClure, was an Irish immigrant who moved to the United States with his widowed mother when he was just 9 years old. He founded the country's first newspaper syndicate, McClure's Syndicate, in 1884.
She has a meeting with S.S. McClure, Sam McClure, and he's starting up his own magazine to be known as McClure's Magazine. He knows of her from her writings that she has published back in the U.S., and so he sets up a meeting with her at her apartment.
He was out of breath. He was always out of breath, but he raced up 5 flights of stairs, told her all his plans for the magazine.
It's supposed to be a 10-minute meeting, and the 10-minute meeting turns into 2 hours.
And he wanted her to come work for him. And he also borrowed $40. So he left, and Ida thought, I'll never see that money again. But the next day, money arrived. He had New York send the money, so he was principled about that.
She's fascinated by him, and she forgets to ask him the important questions of, well, what do you want me to write about, and how much will you pay me? She's just that sort of taken in by him. For somebody who's always been so meticulously planned, she forgets the very important questions.
And so thus began this amazing partnership.
That which moved me most deeply, gave me joy that made me weep, was that now I should have something to show my family. I had felt a deserter. My father's and brother's experiences in the oil business, of which I want to speak later, were more than discouraging. They were alarming. My sister was ill and in the hospital. My mother's letters were saturated with anxiety. And here I was, the eldest child in the family, a woman of year and of some experience, who had been given an education, whose social philosophy demanded that she do her part in working out family problems. Here I was across the ocean, writing picayune pieces at 1/4 of a cent a word while they struggled there. I felt guilty, and the only way I had kept myself up to what I had undertaken was the hope that I could eventually make a substantial return.
Ida began writing for McClure while still in Paris. But after spending 2 years in the city, she returned to the United States in the summer of 1892. Her first stop was Titusville for a much-needed visit with her family. It also served as a last professional reprieve before her career would skyrocket. From there, she traveled to New York City, where she would begin working for McClure's magazine full-time.
When she went to work for McClure, he brought her back to the States. First, she went to New York briefly, and then he sent her to Washington, D.C. to write about Napoleon Bonaparte. The series was an enormous success, absolutely enormous. And she had saved the magazine because the magazine was often in financial trouble because McClure had such big ideas that needed funding. And so the next idea was Abraham Lincoln. And Ida went around to the states, Illinois and Kentucky, where Abraham Lincoln had lived, and interviewed people who had known him. She went to the general store with the Cracker Barrel and talked to people who had seen him split rails, which he hated. And she, in her work, uncovered the Abraham Lincoln we know today.
The legacy of Ida Tarbell is really important in so many ways. First of all, from my perspective, that she is female and she is branching out, stepping out into what had been and what was a man's arena, right? So she's engaging in politics. And historically, many in society saw politics as being, it's a dirty game. Proper women shouldn't be involved in politics because they're supposed to be well behaved and they're not supposed to hear those backroom conversation and things like that that happens historically with politics.
One of her main achievements was, and she would say it was her main achievement in regard to Lincoln, Ida showed that they were honest, hardworking, decent people, and she became the leading authority and biographer of Abraham Lincoln, and it made her loved. I mean, because people loved Lincoln and they loved what she presented. And she said, Abraham Lincoln made me an American.
With the popularity of her biographies on Napoleon, and more notably Lincoln, Ida became more than a patriot. She became a voice of authority in journalism. John D. Rockefeller came from humble beginnings. He was born in the small town of Richford, New York in 1839 to Eliza and William Rockefeller. William, his father, spent much of John's childhood as a traveling con man.
William Avery went around and manipulated people, going from town to town, pretending to be a doctor and mute and deaf and getting handouts from people and then coming home to his family and being like, oh, here's some money. And then off again in another couple months to do the same thing somewhere else until he was found out. And that's not who John was. And that's not who he wanted to be either. He did not want to be associated with his father.
John began work as a bookkeeper for a produce merchant company named Hewitt & Tuttle. There, he learned how to build partnerships, barter with ship captains and freight agents, and negotiate transportation costs, which most believed were fixed rates. John went on to form his own produce commission firm in 1859. As the Civil War ended, Rockefeller turned his attention from food to the oil industry. In the wake of the boom years prior, oil industry leaders thought the only useful byproduct of crude oil was kerosene. Much of the residual was flushed into nearby waterways.
Because he had heard about Samuel McClure refining it into kerosene in Pittsburgh and the oil industry with this completely new substance, using it as an illuminant and something that could take the place of whale oil, something that was in our own backyard. I mean, why not jump on that bandwagon?
By 1868, with the help of a new business partner, the company owned the largest oil refinery in the world in Cleveland. 2 years later, Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler formed the Standard Oil Company. This was the same year the Tarbell family moved from the Pithole area to Titusville.
John D. Rockefeller was a business genius. He insisted on efficiency. He did not want a drop wasted. Everything was to be used. By 1880, it was in control of 90% of oil refining.
Almost every state that there was oil discovered had a Standard Oil. California, Texas, Kansas, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. John figured it out. He figured it out how to give birth to this industry in a way that, it's still sustaining today.
Business trusts are unincorporated business organizations created for the benefit and profit of their shareholders, known as trustees. Much like an LLC or corporation, it has the added benefit of private ownership. It does not require permission from the state to operate, have public disclosures, nor does it have fees or mandatory reporting to the state. It only requires the consent of the involved parties, as is a private operating agreement. Because of this, it can avoid many of the expenses of an LLC or corporation. Trusts involve less government intrusion. In the early 20th century, business trusts were very popular because they avoided government prohibitions on developing land. Eventually, the use of business trusts lessened because the rules governing corporations diminished. Typically, attorneys and other regulators opted for state-sanctioned entities, for obvious reasons including they are easier to locate, regulate, and easier to sue. Trusts remain a powerful way for businesses with regard to asset management, protection, and wealth transfer.
The South Improvement Railroad Company offered special rates to Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company for the transport of his oil, a privilege not granted to smaller producers and refiners. The Oil War of 1872 started when protests broke out and rail cars were vandalized. Rockefeller's part in the railway scandal brought death threats from the independent oil producers in the Titusville area.
This happened in large measure because of deals that he made with the railroads, kickbacks and drawbacks. He got a certain amount of money from what his competitors paid to the railroads. Railroads were supposed to be common carriers with the same price for everyone, but he got special deals. And so when Rockefeller was able to have control of refining, this became a problem for the producers in Titusville, including Ida's father.
Although a lot of the things that he did were considered unethical at the time, there were no railroad regulations. The railroads could do as they pleased with who they wanted to give rebates to or who they didn't want to cut breaks to. He did it as if he was kind of like a father trying to teach his fledgling child his knowledge of business, the way that his brain worked. This was what he was charged to do on Earth.
Ida was a young girl during the turmoil of that time. The struggles her family faced then would be something that would be reflected throughout her life and her work.
In those days, I looked with more contempt on the man who had gone over to the Standard than on the one who had been in jail. I felt pity for the latter man, but none for the deserters from the ranks of the fighting independents.
Franklin, Ida's father, remains an independent oil producer. He never sells out to a bigger company and, of course, never sells out to Standard Oil, which means the Tarbells never become fabulously wealthy. People who did sell out to Rockefeller, they were paid in Standard Oil stock. And that was, in the long run, better than cash because that stock just became more and more valuable. So those who did sell out to Standard Oil typically ended up pretty well off, which is why the Tarbells stayed more of a middle-class family.
In Samuel McClure's eyes, Ida's formative years in the world's first oil boomtown made her the perfect journalist to investigate the expanding monopoly. By this time, the oil company and its business tactics were like tentacles that gripped every aspect associated with producing and refining oil. It was this metaphor that earned the Standard Oil Company the moniker of the octopus. In her 40s, the worldly Ida saw the risk inherent in putting Standard Oil under her microscope. She was, in a word, reluctant.
Sam McClure knows her background, that she grew up in the oil region, that her father has dealings in the petroleum industry. So he asks her to write about Standard Oil. And Standard Oil, with John D. Rockefeller at its helm, is making a lot of money and making a lot of deals that are very questionable. And it's very typical of that time period, of these pieces of journalism that turn into bigger stories, exposing what's really happening. She talks to Franklin about it, and he also doesn't think that this is a good idea. This could be dangerous for her career, for her reputation. Standard Oil and, of course, John D. Rockefeller have so many resources and so much money.
What's the phrase? The only thing that needs to happen for evil to flourish is for good people to do nothing. Now, the quote really says good men, but I said people. It's interesting that she's from Northwestern Pennsylvania. Really, not New York City, not Philly, not Washington, D.C., but she's from a small community in Northwestern Pennsylvania, yet she is able, because she is persistent, she refuses to give up on this call on her life. I'll put it in religious terms, the call on her life to do something about Standard Oil Company and its practices.
When she started writing about the Standard Oil Company, she expected to find that the men she knew in Titusville were wrong, but as she got more into the story and learned more about his business practices, she certainly changed her opinion. She felt that if he'd followed the law, he would have been almost as successful, and he would have been a hero.
The one thing that makes her history of Standard Oil successful is her relationship with H.H. Rogers, who was an executive at Standard Oil. But Rogers was in the oil region, and they have a shared history and memories of Rouseville in the early days. They have some of the similar experiences. Of course, there's an age difference, but they are able to have those conversations and reminisce, and all that comes with nostalgia. And Rogers tells her things that he probably wouldn't have told anybody else, coupled with the fact that she was also a woman, that maybe he didn't take her as seriously.
The Standard Oil Company operated in various states, and so it was very difficult to understand the full dimensions of the thing nationally. And so her series of articles provided lawyers and people who were determined to do something about the situation.
Between 1902 and 1904, McClure's magazine published Ida's 19-part series on the history of Standard Oil. In those pieces, she systematically makes the case about how monopolies and trusts are harmful to the economy and against our best interest as a country. The series is later compiled into a book simply titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. The case she makes is so thorough against the company, it even catches the attention of then-President Theodore Roosevelt.
It was decided that the situation should be investigated by the Bureau of Corporations that Teddy Roosevelt had set up. Today we call it the Federal Trade Commission.
You have a president who does care about her publication on Standard Oil Company. So the fact that he reads her report and doesn't just cast it aside, he is certainly moved by what she is writing. And the evidence that she provides makes it simply impossible to challenge what she has written. So I think the fact that if If Roosevelt had not accepted the report, I don't even know that we'd be studying about her, would we?
The situation in Kansas was pretty much like Pithole. The problem was, however, that Standard Oil would not cooperate. And Teddy Roosevelt invited some of the executives of Standard Oil to come and talk to him, and they had a pleasant tea and felt that the executives left feeling everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't, because Teddy Roosevelt couldn't tell them to their face, but he was really furious. So in 1905, the House of Representatives decided there needed to be an investigation. And from this, there developed a court case. And Kansas just led the way in going after Rockefeller, and the cases moved their way up to the Supreme Court.
Despite John's best efforts, the government finally catches up with him to serve him a subpoena to testify in court on the company's violation of the Sherman antitrust law. He takes the stand in Illinois.
At first, he wasn't going to, but he decided to, because if he testified there, he wouldn't have to testify anywhere else. He wouldn't have to testify in Ohio. He wouldn't have to testify in any of the other court cases for Standard Oil. They would ask him a question, he would sit and ponder, and then he would answer even slower, to the point where some people saw him as a feeble man, and why are they making this sweet old man testify in court?
The Standard was found guilty, and a punishment, long known as the Big Fine, $29 million inflicted. The country gasped at the size of the fine, but not so the Bureau of Corporations. My correspondent there contended that over 8,000 true indictments had been found, and that the maximum penalty would have amounted to over $160 million.
But ultimately, following the ruling, this fine was never collected.
It ended up that he did not have to serve any jail time. He wasn't concerned with any kind of fines that they could give him, because they wouldn't be paid out for years and years because of all the other court cases that would have to be taken care of throughout Standard Oil.
The judge's decision aroused general exultation in the oil regions, as any failure of the Standard to get what it wanted was bound to do, and with good reason. What one set of men had done, another could do. The future of competition in oil seemed to be up to the oil men themselves.
There's some political cartoons of the day that show Rockefeller kind of being annoyed with Ida, or Ida being frustrated by Rockefeller, but really it doesn't damage her reputation. He doesn't personally attack her in any way. And really, at the end of the day, Standard Oil is broken up because it's deemed to be a monopoly and it must be divided into 30-some companies. But really, all that does is make Rockefeller richer.
What was also happening was the automobile was becoming a dominant force in American life. And so Rockefeller had a new way to make money. It wasn't lamp oil anymore. Now it was petroleum.
By 1906, at age 49, having laid her father to rest the previous year, Ida was ready to move on from McClure's and spearhead a publication of her own. With a handful of co-workers who were fed up with Samuel McClure's continued and exhausting antics, they did just that, buying the American magazine. That same year, Ida moved the remaining Tarbell family, including her aging mother, Esther, her brother William, and her sister Sarah, to Easton, Connecticut. Tarbell would continue to write investigative pieces through 1915, while also touring, lecturing, and sharing stories of her adventures as she continued to travel the world. John D. Rockefeller Sr., his son John D. Jr., and their business associates went on to form the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. This organization leads philanthropic missions to better living conditions around the globe. One of the foundation's early humanitarian efforts involved medical research, which led to solving thousands of cases of hookworm in the southern U.S., which was still recovering from the Civil War. After touring, giving lectures about her works, Tarbell served on President Wilson's Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense during World War I.
Was Ida Tarbell a feminist? Well, some people would say she was. She probably would say she was not. But here she is doing things that the feminist movement of the 20th century said women should be doing, having their voices heard. You know, she was a muckraker, so she was causing trouble for men in society, powerful men, you know, and she got away with it.
Although she was known for standing up for the voiceless, she shocked many of her peers when she denounced the idea of women gaining the right to vote.
Why wouldn't someone like that support the right to vote for women? It really is a mystery in some ways. Why? I am, honestly, I've studied women's history for all of my professional life, and it boggles the mind why women would be opposed to women's right to vote or to women's rights in general. But there are some women who do hold to traditional views and believe that, shall we say, a woman's place is in the home. Well, obviously, Tarbell didn't really believe that because she was engaging and she was stepping out. She was breaking the mold that society had prescribed for her.
Despite criticism over her disagreements with the suffragette movement, Tarbell continues to be a model for informed and respected journalism in present times, as many of the issues she brought to light seem to be reaching a boiling point today. There is a continued effort to keep the legacy of the Tarbell family alive. One group, the Oil Region Alliance, even bought the old Tarbell home, though it looked much different then. In recent years, they've restored the cupola, which was the defining feature of the structure, and also where Ida spent countless hours as a teenager examining things through her microscope.
Coming from a history and historic preservation background and actually get to work with history in historic buildings is amazing.
Today, guests can attend an event called Tarbell Tea, which features a student of the local high school portraying Ida.
We underestimated how much money we would need, so we got there and we were poor.
While fellow classmates also share stories of other local figures who have impacted local history. This event offers a fun and educational experience that funds upkeep of the more than 150-year-old home.
It's part of their heritage, whether their family was in the oil industry or something like that. It's something that they should have the opportunity of feeling pride for.
Ida died in Connecticut in 1944. She was 86 years old. She's buried in Titusville alongside her family. While her work helped lawmakers gain control over monopolies of the era, we seem to have lost sight of what a healthy business ecosystem is once again, with many industries seeing large corporations consolidating power.
Yeah, Senator, we have volume discounts that we offer to some merchants. I suspect Walmart is one of them.
Why is it that small businesses continue to use Visa and MasterCard when you're getting charged so much more?
In my opinion, it's a matter of convenience for the customer.
Maybe is it because that Visa and MasterCard are effectively monopolies? They control 80% of the market?
Certainly part of the
80% of the market?
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. We see the consequences all across America, and we've seen it before. More than a century ago, but the American people stood up to the robber barons back then and busted the trusts. They didn't punish the wealthy, just made the wealthy play by the rules everybody else had to. And we've got to do that again.
The question now is, who will be our generation's Ida Tarbell?
Chronicles is made possible by a grant from the Erie Community Foundation, a community assets grant provided by the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, support from Spring Hill Senior Living, the Regional Science Consortium, and the generous support of Thomas B. Hagen.
We question and learn.